They say the customer is always right, but when an arrogant local millionaire tried to steal from me, knowing perfectly well that my boss would dock the money straight from the meager paycheck I needed to support my pregnant wife, I realized a fundamental truth. Some people aren't just wrong. They are actively begging to be destroyed. This was back in the late 90s. I was 24, exhausted, and barely scraping by. My wife, Sarah, had been put on bed rest due to complications, meaning my income was the only thing keeping a roof over our heads. I was working the graveyard shift at a small-town convenience store in the freezing Midwest, part of a corporate chain based out of Ames, Iowa. It was the kind of soul-crushing job where the fluorescent lights buzzed loudly enough to give you a migraine, and the coffee always tasted like burnt copper. My store manager was a guy named Greg. Greg was a corporate bootlicker of the highest order, the kind of guy who would sell his own mother for a modest quarterly bonus. 3 weeks before this incident, Greg had instituted a new highly illegal policy. He told us that any register shortages and any gas drive-offs would be deducted directly from our paychecks. I tried to fight it. I told him it was against labor laws, but Greg just smiled his smarmy smile and told me I was welcome to look for work elsewhere if I didn't like it. He knew I couldn't quit. He knew Sarah was expecting, and he held my job over my head like a guillotine. It was the ultimate betrayal from an employer, forcing the lowest paid workers to subsidize corporate losses and the theft of strangers. Enter Richard Sterling. Sterling was a local real estate developer who drove a pristine, massive luxury truck that he treated better than his own children. He was a regular, and he was universally despised by everyone in town. Sterling treated retail workers like chewing gum stuck to the bottom of his expensive Italian loafers. He'd throw cash on the counter instead of handing it to you. He'd leave trash on the shelves, and he loved to belittle people who couldn't talk back. He was a bully, plain and simple, and because he was wealthy, Greg absolutely worshipped him. Greg had even warned me specifically to always keep Mr. Sterling happy or risk losing my job. Sterling knew this. He knew he had immunity, and he abused it every single chance he got. It was a freezing Tuesday night in November. The wind was howling across the flat Iowa plains, rattling the large glass windows of the storefront. The only other person working was a high school kid named Toby, who was running the pizza oven in the back corner. It was nearing midnight, and I was mentally calculating if I had enough money left in my checking account to buy Sarah her prenatal vitamins that week. I was down to my absolute last $10. That's when the bell above the door chimed, and in walked Richard Sterling. He had just finished pumping gas at pump number 4. He stormed in, stamping the snow off his designer boots, radiating entitlement and a foul mood. I pasted on my best customer service smile, completely unaware that this man was about to try and take the food right out of my family's mouths. Sterling approached the register, his face red with the cold, but his eyes gleaming with that familiar, arrogant malice. "I am not paying for that last gallon of gas," he barked, slamming his hand down on the counter. I blinked, completely taken aback. I asked him politely what the problem was. He claimed that the automatic shutoff valve on the pump had malfunctioned, causing a massive spill on the concrete, and he refused to pay for the gas that didn't go into his precious truck. I leaned over the counter and looked out the front window. Under the harsh canopy lights, I could clearly see the puddle he was talking about. It was maybe 4 or 5 inches across. At most, it was 4 ounces of gas, a few pennies worth. I respectfully informed him of the store policy. Pointing to the giant signs plastered on every single pump, I told him that customers were responsible for whatever they pumped, and that 4 ounces was hardly a gallon's worth of fuel. Sterling didn't care. He got incredibly asinine. He leaned over the counter, getting right in my face, his breath smelling heavily of expensive scotch and cheap cigars. "I don't care what your little signs say, boy," he sneered. "I'm not paying the full amount. What are you going to do about it? My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what would happen. If he shorted the register by $1.50, Greg would take it out of my check. And if I argued, Greg would fire me for disrespecting his favorite VIP customer. I was trapped. I stared at Sterling's smug, punchable face. He knew he had me cornered. He thought I was just a desperate, poor 20-something who would roll over and take the financial hit so he could feel like a big man. But something inside me snapped. I thought about my wife, lying in bed at home, trusting me to take care of her. I thought about Greg's betrayal, forcing me to absorb the costs of thieves, and I looked at this millionaire, trying to steal from a guy making minimum wage over a spilled teacup of gasoline. I didn't say a single word to him. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for my job. I just maintained unbroken eye contact, stepped out from behind the counter, and started walking. I walked slowly and deliberately around the front of the registers, passing the pizza station where Toby the teenage cook was watching with wide, terrified eyes. I walked straight to the payphone mounted on the wall near the front doors. Sterling spun around, his smug expression faltering for the very first time. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. I picked up the heavy plastic receiver, deposited a quarter, and looked him dead in the eye. "I am calling 911 to report an attempted theft," I said loudly and clearly. "You pumped the gas. You are refusing to pay for it. That is a crime." The color instantly drained from Sterling's face. For all his bluster, he was a local businessman with a reputation to uphold. The absolute last thing he wanted was a police cruiser pulling into the lot with its lights flashing, especially considering he smelled like a distillery. "Put the damn phone down," he yelled, rushing back to the counter. "Get back to the register. I'll pay the full amount, you little piece of trash." I hung up the phone and walked back. As I rang up his transaction, he called me every derogatory name in the book. He insulted my intelligence, my upbringing, my family. I didn't respond. I just gave him a blank, dead-eyed retail stare, which only enraged him further. Once the transaction was complete and the drawer slammed shut, Sterling wasn't finished. He couldn't let a minimum wage worker win. He pulled a small leather-bound notebook and a gold pen out of his expensive coat pocket. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you?" he hissed. "Well, you just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. I want you to give me the president's address. Now." He meant the president of our convenience store chain. He wanted to write a letter to corporate to get me fired, to rip away my livelihood right when my wife needed it most. He was ready to destroy my family over his own bruised ego. It was in that exact second that the universe handed me a gift. A spark of pure, malicious inspiration lit up my brain. He asked for the president's address. He didn't specify which president. Cue the malicious compliance. I looked at him, my expression completely deadpan, and I answered him in the most respectful, subservient tone I could muster. "Yes, sir," I told him. "It's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. I don't know the zip code offhand. I am so sorry." The sheer rage had completely blinded him. He was so incredibly mad, so focused on getting me fired, that the words didn't even process in his brain. He didn't realize what I had just given him. He just frantically scribbled it down in his little leather notebook as fast as his gold pen could write. Once he finished, he snapped the notebook shut, shoved it triumphantly into his pocket, and leaned across the counter one last time. "You'll be hearing from the Home Office," he snarled. "The second they receive my letter, you are out on the street." He turned on his heel and began marching toward the glass doors, looking incredibly proud of himself. I couldn't resist. As his hand hit the door handle, I raised my voice just enough to echo through the empty store. "Sire!" I called out. He stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around slowly, his chest puffed out, and growled back, "What?" I smiled at him. The biggest, fakest, most sickeningly sweet retail smile I could physically produce. "Have a nice night," I said cheerfully. I swear, under the fluorescent lights, I could actually see the thick blue vein on his forehead throb. He was so angry he couldn't even form words. He just let out an incoherent grunt, shoved the door open, and stormed across the icy lot to his massive truck. The moment his taillights faded down the dark highway, Toby, the teenage pizza cook, stepped out from the back. He had watched the entire showdown in stunned silence. "Dude," Toby said, shaking his head slowly, "you're cold." I looked at him, confused. "Which part?" I asked. "The 9/11 threat?" Toby laughed. "No, man. Telling him to have a nice night. That was ice cold." I started laughing hysterically. I realized then that Toby hadn't caught the joke either. I had to sit him down and explain to him exactly what address I had just given Mr. Richard Sterling. When Toby finally realized I had given him the address to the White House, he nearly passed out from laughing so hard. It's been years, but the aftermath of that night still brings a massive smile to my face. According to town gossip, Sterling drafted a massive, furious letter demanding my immediate termination, filled with incredibly aggressive language, and mailed it off to the address I gave him. That means he mailed an unhinged, physically threatening letter directly to the President of the United States. A few weeks later, two very serious men in dark suits from the Secret Service showed up at Sterling's real estate office to interrogate him about his threatening correspondence to the White House. Greg, my boss, tried to fire me when he heard about the mix-up, but I told him I literally just gave the customer exactly what he asked for. To avoid a wrongful termination suit, he had to back down. Sarah and I welcomed a beautiful baby boy shortly after. I quit that miserable job, and Sterling, he never showed his smug face in that gas station ever again.